sit down and like look at our finances up, because I don't do that at all, really, which is kind of probably not smart.
They're not my victims. People die.
Kyle, stop cursing.
Don't be
Rude. Are you kidding me?
Shut the up about marriage.
You understand that? And remember to
Let me go.
I'm just like, oh my God, this is real.
Losing the possibility of maybe reconciling things with Lauren.
Well, we can always buy a new table.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Mr. doesn't want to spend a penny, we'll just buy a new table.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our May video essay. When we first started making this video essay series all the way back in October of last year, we started with a video all about the rom-com and how it semi-permanently, or perhaps actually permanently, altered how millennial women in particular view money. And love too, but we're a little less concerned about that on the channel. But when it comes to the intersection of pop culture and finance, few genres have had more of an impact of late than reality television. Because if America has always been a TV watching nation, and a TV producing nation for that matter, as of late we are distinctly a reality TV nation. And when you look at the numbers for some of the more institutional reality shows, you see just how much of a chokehold this genre really has on our culture. Quote, surprisingly, reality TV has been around since 1948, even though it became popular in the 21st century. Today, about 79% of adult TV watchers in the United States watch these reality TV shows. Despite their longevity, these shows continue to attract viewers. After being on air for 13 years, in 2019, America's Got Talent acquired an average of 41.6 million viewers. Another example is Survivor, which is currently airing its 46th season since its debut in 2000. According to Nielsen, Survivor maintains its popularity with an average of 6.59 million viewers, making a 4% increase year over year. And what's interesting about our current era of reality TV is how much it's become a kind of endless loop of life imitating art, imitating life, imitating art. As a frequent watcher of reality TV across basically all genres, my personal theory on their explosion in popularity in recent years has always been that in addition to being extremely cheap to produce, and usually not beholden to things like union rules, these shows provide a very satisfying and often cathartic mirror to the economic turmoil a lot of us have been experiencing. The current version of reality TV we are watching had its birth in the early 2000s, pretty shortly before the 2008 crash. They've traced a very unique timeline in American history. We've gone from the false illusions of wealth, supported by things like shoddy mortgages and easy credit cards, which provided the underpinnings of TV sensations like Laguna Beach, or the earliest reality dating and makeover shows. Since then, though, most Americans have been greatly disillusioned about what it actually means to look that wealthy. And as these shows have only upped the stakes in the glamour, the wealth, and the beauty displayed, everyday people, including the people on these shows themselves, have become less and less able to keep up appearances. For me, reality TV is kind of the ultimate black mirror of the culture we live in. And watching these people attain these glamorous lives and build these massive social media followings, only to then be undertaken in scandal and bankruptcy and failure, almost provides a kind of cosmic sense of justice. I mean, listen, we're not out here bringing the aristocracy into the town square with the guillotines, so the cast of some glamorous reality show getting canceled is basically the closest thing we have. But it's not just the economic downturn that's been happening in the background, there's also been the rise of social media. Maybe no example of this is more relevant than the Kardashians. Starting in 2007, Keeping Up with the Kardashians was initially a show following a semi-famous family based in Los Angeles, centered around middle daughter Kim, whose star was currently rising largely based on her friendship with the then vastly more famous Paris Hilton. And in its early stages, the show documented the rising popularity of the family and their struggle to establish more recognizable and lucrative levels of fame. For example, in early seasons, there were entire story arcs around things like turning an unexpectedly leaked sex tape into long-term career opportunities. And generally, if anything, it was the show that made them most relevant of all. But as the show progressed, the family itself, including the younger generation, most notably Kylie Jenner, became vastly more popular and successful than the show, with their cultural and especially social reach eclipsing the actual viewership of the series. So the series began to document more of the downsides of such extreme fame rather than the pursuit of it, and the symbiotic relationship between the family and the documentation of the family became a meta storyline in many of the later seasons. Who wants to be filmed when, who is happy with their level of fame versus uncomfortable with it, etc. To hear more about our relationship with the Kardashians, the Real Housewives, and other beloved reality show figures, we spoke with Morgan Page, a reality TV expert and host of the podcast Morgan's Pop Talks.
Yeah, I think their show has changed a lot. I mean, obviously, when they came on the scene, they were just a normal, air quotes, normal Hollywood family, I guess. They weren't the Kardashians that we know now, right? With all of these huge platforms and businesses and all of the things. And so the show has definitely taken a different shape over the past 20 years, as it would. I mean, it's normal for things to evolve and change. However, I think in this new Kardashians era, they've become these A-list celebrities. And because of that, they want to live a more private life because they're more heavily scrutinized. I mean, even not talking about any of the scandals that involve the family on the show, I think is a big miss. I mean, I understand why they do it. It's not easy. It's probably very scary for them to, just at the top of my head, like the Balenciaga situation, no word about that. It's really easy for us as viewers to say, oh, talk about it. But on their side of things, it's probably scary and they don't know if they're going to say the right thing. But I think that reflects them not necessarily being completely honest with their audience, which is what made them famous to begin with, was how real and honest they were way back when they were just, a normal Beverly Hills family.
And similarly, today the lure of reality TV fame has become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where one must project an image of already established beauty or wealth or aspiration in order to get cast in the first place. And then the idea is once they are famous from these appearances, they will be able to leverage that exposure into actual aspiration. It's no secret, I'm sure, to most of us that basically anyone who even briefly appears on a reality show almost immediately monetizes all of their social channels for all kinds of brand deals. And in many ways, our social media culture has created a scenario where we are all in some ways performing a kind of reality show for the people who follow us, even just in our own lives. And even if you are only followed by people you have some real life connection with, you are being observed and observing a historically unprecedented number of people compared to previous generations. In big and small ways, we are encouraged to curate an image of ourselves comprised of only the highlights. Essentially, we are the editors in the booths of our own shows, deciding what makes the cut and determining our character and our storyline through how we present ourselves. At the same time, reality TV provides a large-scale projection of these phenomena, normalizing and justifying our culture-wide obsession with projecting aspirational and often unrealistic images.
As I watch more reality TV, I can spot it when it's not real. And then when it is real, it just makes for that much more better television. Like, this season of Vanderpump Rules, a lot of people are talking about this because, you have a main cast member, Lala, who's a bit upset with another main cast member, Ariana, for walking out of a finale party because she doesn't want to talk to her ex, Tom Sandoval. And Lala's point here is, we're filming a TV show. You should have these hard conversations. This is what we do. Ariana's standpoint is, I don't talk to Tom. I'm not going to pretend to talk to Tom because it makes for good TV. And it's just interesting to look at these two women, Lala and Ariana, and see they have a very different perspective on what it is to be a reality star and what is the work, air quotes, that goes into being a reality TV star. Is it coming up with dramatic situations and confrontation, or is it living your real, true, and genuine life? So I feel like sometimes things can be exaggerated for reality TV. Things can be drawn out for reality TV. But I do think if I had to put like a percentage on it, I would say I think probably 35 to 40% would be real and 60% would be exaggerated or manipulated.
And nowhere is this whole concept of reality TV both imitating and driving our own day-to-day lives more evident than in Chapter 1, Hotness Inflation, Reality TV and Our Perception of Beauty. While we are definitely no strangers here at TFD to talking about beauty and consumerism and the ever-increasing stakes of both, I also want to give a shout out to one of my all-time favorite TikTokers, Cecilia Regina 275. Please go follow her, who has an excellent video on the topic of hotness inflation as it pertains to reality TV.
This is part of the first season of The Bachelor. These women are all pretty, but they look like ordinary human beings. This is the cast of the current season of The Bachelor. they are all extraordinarily beautiful. Like exceptionally beautiful. And if you don't obtain that mythical status, men who look like this and wear loafers with no socks will judge you less worthy of love.
And we should note that people getting hotter over time is not just a phenomenon of reality TV. Basically, all of us at this point have seen period pieces where people have a mouthful of veneers and a face full of Botox. And when you go back and watch movies from even the early 2000s, you're often struck by just how much more human the characters often look. I actually watched Notting Hill for the first time recently, and probably one of the biggest takeaways was just how unusual and refreshing it was to see people with imperfect teeth or wrinkles or visibly frizzy hair. But when you look at reality television and its dominance on our culture, if you are someone who's been watching a lot of these long-running shows since their inception, you've probably noticed something very striking. Yes, the production values are better, and often some of the more tone-deaf aspects of the show have been eliminated, but perhaps the most notable change is just how much hotter everyone has gotten over time. Montage of what people used to look like on these shows, and then more recent shows where they're suddenly, inexplicably so much hotter. To use my beloved Real Housewives franchise, and we'll talk about them more later, as one example, we can take the difference between the first ever reunion of the Real Housewives of Orange County all the way back in 2006, which famously took place in one of the housewives' own backyards. They're all sitting there with their mostly original faces, hair and makeup likely done by themselves, and just random outfits that they'd probably already worn to a dinner out in Newport Beach. And then let's compare it to some of the more recently aired reunions of different Real Housewives franchises. Basically, everyone has professional hair and makeup, and are styled as if they're participating in some kind of beauty pageant. But it's not just that. It's also that almost all of them, if not, I think on some franchises, all of them, have undergone major cosmetic procedures that have really clearly altered the way they look. And on basically every mainstream reality show, these days you are very likely to now encounter at least some of the following on most, if not all, of the faces you see. Botox and fillers, laser procedures, veneers, breast augmentation, hair transplants, liposuction, facelifts, blepharoplasty, rhinoplasty, Brazilian butt lifts, and of course, a recent favorite amongst the famous adjacent set, off-label use of Ozempic and similar medications. And this isn't even mentioning many of the reality shows that were themselves explicitly about making over people's appearances. You had things like What Not to Wear, and I actually also loved the BBC version, which was ludicrously brutal towards these women. And if you do go back and watch episodes of the original What Not to Wear now, you will be shocked at just how much women's bodies and appearances are scrutinized and picked over and basically outright humiliated. But at least those shows were largely limited to pretty superficial appearance changes. You also had much more dystopian television like The Swan, which aired all the way back in the early 2000s, aka the Wild West of reality TV. I sort of equate that era to when doctors were smoking cigarettes while delivering babies. Like, we just really did not understand the damage we were doing to ourselves back then. But it is almost unquestionable that the prevalence of these shows at the time, and there were very interesting academic studies all the way back in the early 2000s about their popularity, were a huge factor in the normalization of some of these incredibly invasive and expensive procedures in our culture. And that phenomenon continues today. Quote, a recent study found that 4 out of 5 people seeking plastic surgery said they'd been directly influenced by shows including Extreme Makeover, E's Dr. 90210, MTV's I Want a Famous Face, and Bravo's Miami Slice. The academic journal Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery reported the first known data on how reality television affects plastic surgery patients. More than half of the patients said they watched at least one such program regularly, and most admitted that the shows had played a significant role in their decision to get treatment. While this kind of programming may not be increasing the number of cosmetic surgeries overall, it does seem to be a factor amongst those who are opting for body contouring procedures like liposuction, breast enhancement procedures like breast augmentation, and facial surgery such as rhinoplasty, which are among the most popular surgeries. According to the study, 79% of the 42 patients examined said, quote, television/media influenced their decision to pursue a cosmetic surgery procedure. Only 12% of patients seeking plastic surgery said they'd never seen a reality show about it. And in many cases on these shows, the constant quest to become a hotter, more perfected version of the self becomes its own plotline, with botched or imperfect procedures becoming sources of shame and mockery, or speculation about what one cast member might have had done, making fodder for storylines for the other cast members. Perhaps the most extreme example of this trend is our aforementioned Kardashians, who have essentially made a sport out of gaslighting their young and impressionable audience about the procedures they've had done. Most members of the family have outright lied at various points with regards to cosmetic enhancements, only to come back later and own up to it, and things like extreme weight fluctuations and body type alterations, the epidemic of mysteriously disappearing backsides being the most notable example, are essentially completely avoided in the show itself.
I think it's very pressure filled, and I think it's easy to say like, oh, the housewives, they do too much, and people on Vanderpump Rules or whatever, just in the Bravo sphere, but they also get very heavily scrutinized. So it's like, who do you want to place the blame on? Do you want to place the blame on people who are in the comment section saying, oh my gosh, like you need a facelift, or oh my gosh, like what's going on? They get that constantly. So I feel like, yes, on one hand, it does perpetuate an unrealistic beauty standard, because we look at someone like Kyle Richards, who's just like more beautiful than me. I'm 30 years old, and she's twice my age and she looks younger than me. But at the same time, you have to think about what drives them to do all the procedures. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with like Botox and fillers and all of those things, but you have to imagine that it takes a toll on their mental health. I think it's different when you look at that type of situation to a Kardashians type situation, where I think a lot of us feel like they set the beauty standard and they constantly are moving the goalpost. And, they get a lot of hate in the comments too, but just from the outside looking in, my personal opinion, I like Kourtney the best. And I'm sitting here thinking, why do I like Kourtney the best? And I think it's because she's kind of the only one that's moving away from that. She's the only one that's like posting on Instagram, not retouching her photos. She might be not saying that she's heavy at all, because she's not, but she's not, as thin as she was when she was 21 years old, and she doesn't care. But I think her sisters, on the other hand, think a little bit differently about that.
Essentially, media in general has created an environment of constantly raising stakes around how attractive and youthful and thin people are expected to be in the public eye. And unlike the major A-list celebrities who might have a little bit more leverage to push back on some of these demands, reality stars are lucky to be in the room in the first place, and therefore much more likely to fall prey to conform to these beauty standards. The constantly inflating hotness we see on the shows that we consume only serves to worsen the already existing issue of beauty being framed as fundamentally something we can and should purchase, and something that's downright expected of anyone who's in the public eye. It's always worth noting the first versus second appearance changes that many of these reality stars go under when they come back on their show for a second season. Beauty aside though, when it comes to constantly raised stakes on reality television, it would be impossible not to talk about Chapter 2, how reality TV fuels our obsession with wealth. Most of us who turn to reality television use it as a form of escapism, as getting wrapped up in the personal drama of the uber wealthy is a welcome distraction from our own lives and our financial problems. But I would argue that it further fuels our already established obsession with and glorification of wealth, no matter how poorly these rich people come across on our screens. And when it comes to watching the lives of the ultra-rich unfold in front of us, there is once again one particular family we can't not talk about: the Kardashian-Jenners. In a lot of ways, they are synonymous with the myth of the American dream. In addition to completely remaking their physical appearances from scratch on a regular basis, they have been constantly iterating on and expanding their individual and collective business empires. They sell an image of savvy entrepreneurship, with each member now having had at least one retail venture to varying degrees of sketchiness/success, but they would never have gotten to that without a high level of generational wealth and their infamous father in the first place. Which is why Kylie being named a self-made billionaire back in 2019 was such a source of controversy. Self-made according to whom? By now, most of us have been exposed to all aspects of the Kardashian empire and propaganda to the extent that we kind of know the deal. We know that a lot of what we are being sold ranges somewhere from outright lie to convenient misrepresentation, especially in the case of their personal appearances, and many of their business ventures have been fraught with scandal. There has been endless criticism leveraged at the Kardashians for the toxic ways that they perpetuate some of the worst excesses of both capitalism and beauty culture, but they remain an incredibly relevant cultural force. So why do we still care? According to cultural critic Sachi Cool, the obsession comes from how nice it must seem to be so rich you have no real problems. Quote, within a particular subsection of reality television, that is, shows designed to be aspirational as opposed to revolting, wealth is demonstrated by how dumb, how insignificant, and how imminently solvable your problems are. Most of the fights fall into this exact category, shit too stupid to care about unless you're stupid rich, in which case it's the only shit worth caring about. More money, more problems was always a foolish adage. In reality, the more money you have, the more infinitesimal the problems. Rich people are lucky in so many ways, but chief among them is that they get to care about things that simply do not matter.
The reason why people are drawn to reality TV in general is for entertainment and escapism. You know, we have all of these problems. We're constantly bombarded with things in our everyday life, on the news. It's hard, you know, to live in today's day and age when it comes to things that are going on in the world, you know, money situations at home, whatever. So for me personally, when I'm watching these shows, it is just kind of to get my mind off of everything that's going on. I will say, however, talking about the Kardashians, I know that people are still pretty invested in them, but I actually feel like people are starting to jump off the Kardashian train. I mean, even me specifically, as somebody who watches reality TV for a living, I don't find them super compelling anymore. And I think that's been a shift, not necessarily in the reality TV genre, but just in the way that people view reality TV, because it's gotten so far removed from reality that people just aren't really that interested anymore. Of course, they will have the diehard fans that will watch no matter what. But when it comes to choosing, you know, because that's how most people watch TV. Not everybody is going to sit down every single night and watch every show that's on. I feel like the Kardashians aren't at the top of the list anymore.
And it's worth considering that this entire angle of watch rich people with no real problems create them for themselves has been a staple of reality television culture since at least the Bush years. Not only did the Real Housewives franchise premiere in 2006, but shows like My Super Sweet 16 were already regularly going viral before that was even a term, for videos of incredibly spoiled teenage girls having meltdowns over getting the wrong luxury car for their birthday.
Oh, Mom!
And new shows featuring the super rich are constantly being produced. If you don't like the Kardashians, maybe Bling Empire or Shaws of Sunset will be more up your alley. Also, as both a former Shaws of Sunset watcher, RIP, and a watcher of season 2 of The Traitors US, justice for MJ. And yes, sometimes the casts on these shows do face problems that would upset anyone, like cheating spouses or friend fallouts. But aside from the occasional fraud charge or white-collar crime, and we'll get into that stuff later, most of these shows never portray their cast as dealing with the one problem that the majority of Americans are most faced with: money problems.
She's the only one with work ethic, and she's doing this, this, and this. Kim's always had a shopping problem. It's just escalated as she's made more money.
How is the person that is the least busy? How am I the least busy?
My sister used my wedding as a business opportunity.
In many ways, the increasingly superficial diversity of these shows, representing different cultural enclaves, genders, sexualities, and even geographic locations, serves to make this mythologizing of the American dream a little bit more palatable. We're not just watching the classic old rich white men that we typically associate with grandiose levels of wealth. We're watching people from all different backgrounds assimilate to incredibly aspirational wealth levels, and giving a false portrayal of how realistic the American dream actually is. Because one thing that's really worth noting about most of these wealth-based reality shows is how much they focus on classically new money characters. It's not really shocking that people who would come from generations of obscene wealth would probably not want to put their lives and business out there on a reality show, but the phenomenon of mostly casting people who have only been wealthy for a relatively short period of time gives the impression that this is something more accessible than it actually is. And again, that superficial diversity makes it feel more relatable, more equitable, more democratic. The reality is, the people who are ultra wealthy are pretty demographically similar today to what they've always been. And these shows intentionally focus on the personal relatability as a way to erase their class differences. We tend to view their wealth on these shows as just their personal circumstances, as opposed to the driving force in their lives that makes basically everything else we're watching possible. But what's perhaps more interesting about this reality TV obsession with wealth is how it has become over the years a story of the dog chasing its own tail. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Scamming Your Way to the Top, the Real Housewives story. As someone who has been a die-hard Real Housewives fan for basically its entire iteration, fun/scary fact, I'm almost exactly the same age as the first crop of OC children, I'm acutely aware of the changes that we've seen in the franchise from its origins to its current iteration. Basically, it started as a show that followed already wealthy women into a show that follows women who are either pretending to be wealthy or aspiring to be wealthy. In fact, both I and friend of TFD Erin Lowry, aka Broke Millennial, are such huge Real Housewives fans that we have started a whole new podcast to talk about the finances of the franchise called It's About the Money, a Real Housewives podcast.
These days, the Real Housewife business model feels more influencer at best and grifter at worst, and we are not even getting into things like cameos and merch.
Things that come to mind are things like the candle business that Jim and Meghan King Edmonds started on OC.
We have so many candle businesses.
But who is like, I want the former like third baseman of the St. Louis Cardinals on his fourth marriage with his 17 children to sell me a 3-wick candle.
If you're already a member, you can start listening right now, and if you're not, just hit the join button or become a member over on Patreon. And if you want to test it out first, we've made one of the episodes public here on YouTube for everyone to listen. The Real Housewives in particular serves as perhaps the most interesting economic example of the changes our country has gone through since its inception in 2006 to today in 2024. As I mentioned, the Real Housewives started firmly in the Bush era, and more relevantly, before the 2008 housing crash. When the show started, many of the original cast members had made all or part of their fortunes primarily through real estate, and in many cases were living in extremely expensive McMansions that were already at the top of what they could afford. More franchises began filming in 2007, just before everything came to a screeching halt, and there was a multi-year period across many of the franchises at the time where some of the primary storylines were focused on the recession greatly impacting the cast members' lives. There were cast members served eviction notices on television, some women had to downsize their homes, women who had previously never worked and bragged about it on the show were suddenly having to get jobs, and as Alex McCord of New York once famously said, while Jill Zarin was in high school, she was in Brooklyn trying to survive in this economy. The Reba McEntire of the Housewives franchise. But it's interesting that despite having such an early reckoning as a franchise with real-world economic consequences, the pathway for many housewives has not been living under their means to prevent future catastrophe, but rather constantly striving toward a socioeconomic class that they just frankly can't belong to. The show has been in a steep decline towards scamming and fakery on basically all franchises, and while there was always some smoke and mirrors with the money being portrayed on the show, with the Giudices opening the New Jersey franchise by paying for 6 figures worth of furniture in cash, for example, the stakes have constantly been ramping up to where even women who are doing pretty well are having to engage in some unsavory practices to keep up with the Joneses. For reference on what happened to the aforementioned Giudices, whose finances always seemed incredibly shady, in 2009, the same year The Real Housewives of New Jersey aired season 1, Joe and Teresa filed for bankruptcy but ended up withdrawing the petition in 2010. In 2013, the couple were charged with conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, and bank fraud, including making false statements on loan applications and bankruptcy fraud. Initially, the couple both pled not guilty, but in 2014, they struck a plea deal and both entered a guilty plea and agreed to pay $414,000 in restitution. They were given staggered jail time so that one parent could stay home with their daughters. For every Real Housewives franchise, there's been at least one major financial scandal over the years, and an ongoing dynamic where rather than hiring women who had an established level of extreme wealth, they hired women who were doing pretty well for themselves and then immediately pressured to aim to that much higher tax bracket.
I think it's so interesting when you think back, when these shows started, they were not at all what they are now. They really were normal women following their lives with their husbands and their kids. And as the shows grew bigger and they got glam squads and they got social media followings, it started to attract a different type of person, you know, like a business scammer, someone like a Jen Shah. So I just think that's interesting that over the years, it has changed into what it attracts as far as cast members go. As far as why it makes for compelling television, I mean, people love a scandal. It's like, it's like, even if you don't want to love a scandal, people love scandals. They can't look away from it. You have to know how it ends. You have to know how they got there. You have to know all the behind the scenes of it. It's like when you have a housewife on a Nightline documentary, it's like, this is our Super Bowl. Why is this happening to us? You would have never imagined that this is what this road would lead down. But I just think it's interesting that those type of people go on reality TV not thinking that, you know, the cat is going to come out of the bag at some point.
And perhaps the franchise that has brought the Real Housewives into its true scamming future is Salt Lake City, which is a city and community in many ways predisposed to fraudulent business models because of the high prevalence of the Mormon community. Our podcast, Too Good to Be True, which you can find here on YouTube, has a whole episode on this, but here's just a little clip on why the Mormon Church has such a long and storied history with MLMs.
Salt Lake City. I mean, Mormonism, MLMs, like that.
The world's capital of Mormonism and the world's capital of multi-level marketing.
Who are these women? I mean, are any of them actual Mormons? I'm curious.
So many of the cast members are either currently or formerly Mormon. And so the show ties in a lot, more than any of the other shows in the franchise, ties in a lot of stuff about faith and community. See, over in Salt Lake City, the problem with exposing the MLMs and the negative businesses is that there are so many scams and crimes being done by the cast that they have to pick one and maybe a half per season to focus on.
No.
So Whitney Rose has gotten away with her husband scandalously having several lawsuits from his former company, which was determined to be a pyramid scheme. The show has never even brought it up.
And while her story wasn't an MLM exactly, it was more like spearfishing elderly and vulnerable people for their limited financial resources, Jen Shah is probably the most famous of the Salt Lake City cast for her scammy behavior, and is currently serving a 6.5-year sentence in prison for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And one of the things that this superficially glossy and glamorous show has given to us is a hyper-normalization of MLMs. And not just in Salt Lake City, but more generally, the superficial glossiness of the Real Housewives franchise has normalized an incredible prevalence of MLMs. We have things like our beloved wife, Miss Candy Burris, who very notably runs her own sex toy MLM, Brianna Culberson of OC fame quitting her nursing job to push her essential oils MLM full-time. Yikes. Or the particularly dystopian Teddy Mellencamp business model where you work your way up the organization ladder to become a coach who essentially berates members into starving themselves to lose weight, with many of the leaked plans totaling to only 500 calories a day. Ultimately, the Real Housewives franchise is an interesting case study for what happens when the initial promise of the show, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, becomes almost entirely out of reach by the women who are meant to deliver on it. And what we're left with is often a meta story on these women attempting to become the ideal of a housewife in real time. And as I mentioned, in many ways, this show feels distinctly reminiscent of our broader culture post-2008 crash. Living our lives in an infinitely more connected and visible way than we were pre-2008, the pressure on us to display a certain level of aspiration and success and competency has only increased. Even many normal people don't want to reuse outfits twice on Instagram. And the pressure to keep up with appearances only leads to more and more bad financial decision-making. Cut to the rising number of millennials and Gen Z who are finding themselves in credit card debt for completely superficial spending. And for reality TV as a concept, ultimately what makes the most compelling television is people who are willing to risk portraying themselves badly. And the more institutionally wealthy they are, and therefore the less they actually need the TV paycheck or exposure, the less likely they're going to be to behave that way. The show fundamentally needs the strivers and the scammers to make interesting TV. Look at the resuscitation that Monica's antics provided to the latest season of Salt Lake City, for example, and you can't say it wasn't at least partially linked to the fact that she's in a visibly lower tax bracket than most wives and therefore willing to go a lot further in her quest for airtime. But if the entire concept of being a real housewife feels very dated for our current gender norms, it's probably because the image that reality TV projects to us about gender and money and love is in general incredibly backwards. Which brings us to Chapter 4. Reality TV and Gender, a Financial Catastrophe. One of the most striking things about romantic reality TV shows, no matter how superficially advanced they have become on issues like sexuality or age, is how completely gendered the dynamic still tends to be when it comes to money and heterosexual relationships. In shows like Love is Blind, The Bachelor, Love Island, there's a very fundamental expectation in place that the man be the primary earner and that his financial success is a key part of his attractiveness. Many of us millennials may have memory hold this because we were a little too young, but there was actually an entire dating reality show back in the early 2000s, again the Wild West, called Joe Millionaire, where the entire premise was tricking a group of women into thinking that they were competing for the love of a very wealthy man, only to reveal at the end that he's basically a brokey and see if they would still want to date him knowing that fact.
Really misleading him. $50 million worth of misleading him.
Of course, the entire concept that you've just spent weeks lying to these women and constructing a false persona should apparently have no bearing on their decision of whether or not they'd still want to have a long-term relationship with this man. The takeaway is basically, unless you still love him exactly the same as a brokey, you're a superficial wench. There was also the impossibly sinister I Want to Marry Harry, where another unsuspecting group of women were convinced that the man they were competing for was actually literally Prince Harry. And while I could do an entire digression on this show, because I think it is truly the most deranged thing that reality TV has ever produced, I will just recommend that you go watch the Big Joel video on the subject because he does it better justice than I ever could. Point being, a man's finances, just like women's beauty, have always been incredibly central to these reality TV franchises, and perhaps nowhere has the catastrophes that can create been more evident than on my beloved Golden Bachelor. Now, for those who didn't watch the show, goofy but lovable boomer Gary was positioned as a reasonably successful, quote, restaurateur on the show, in addition to a lot of other character traits that proved to be somewhat questionable. First of all, he's not a restaurateur, but also the fundamental idea that he had just been a lonely bachelor since his wife's passing was completely untrue, as it was revealed in an expose that he had actually entered a long-term relationship with another woman only months after becoming widowed, and well before going on the show. But the crux of the expose was actually revealing the incredible precarity of his financial state and the fact that finances were a core source of dissolution between himself and his most recent girlfriend. And in the show, while the entire time he seemed to have an affinity for one of the younger female contestants, a former professional dancer named Leslie, he made a late-stage pivot to fellow widow Teresa almost immediately after she revealed the very healthy state of her own finances and the fact that she still worked at a high-earning job. Anyone who watched that show saw how that man's eyes lit up when she started talking about her money. He had like the sparkly anime eyes. So Gary and Teresa went on to get married only to become the fastest ever divorcing couple in Bachelor history.
It's probably time for us to dissolve our marriage.
Now, they claim their separation is because neither party wants to relocate, but with the extensive deception happening on the show around his money and life, and the fact that Teresa is a finance professional who likely has practiced extreme money savviness throughout her life to get where she is, I highly doubt that money didn't play a role. But just the fact that Gary's financial and professional state had to be so completely misrepresented on the show for him to be perceived as desirable speaks volumes in and of itself. Because ultimately, if what we want from women on these shows is youth and beauty, what we want from men is financial aspiration.
From what I was gathering online, and this is just speculation, but you know, Gary is retired and he wants to travel and he wants to do all of these things. Teresa has no signs of slowing down. You know, she's independent, she's making her own money, and it didn't work out. So I don't know if that can speak for every relationship when it comes to The Bachelor in terms of, you know, gender roles, but I did think it was it's an interesting, you know, not, I guess, social experiment to look at it in that way, that it really didn't work out because potentially the female wanted to continue working and building her success.
And if we look at another zeitgeisty reality show, Love is Blind, we can see how regularly the gender dynamics differ when it comes to money. In the first season of Love is Blind, we met a couple, Amber and Barnett, where the woman had gotten herself into a considerable amount of both student and credit card debt, despite not finishing her degree. And the assumption going into their wedding, and for the record they are still married, was that Barnett would simply absorb that debt as his own. In fact, we even saw him on the show downsize his living situation to help pay off her debts. And this was framed on the show as gallant, an act of love, and more importantly on some level, a man's responsibility. Several seasons later, we saw the exact opposite dynamic, where a man, Izzy, and a woman, Stacy, got engaged, and the man revealed that he was also carrying some pretty serious debt. Stacy's immediate response was to protect her own finances and to not take his debt on as her own. She ended up saying no at the altar, spoiler alert, and it was treated as kind of a Yas Queen moment. Now here's the thing, I don't personally think that anyone owes someone else taking on their debt. That is a choice that everyone has to make for themselves, and it's pretty wise to give that considerable thought before you actually enter into a legally binding marriage with someone. But the way that debt and responsibility and ownership were framed in the show and continue to be framed very clearly falls along gender lines.
That show in particular took off so fast that it's like, I feel like it only took one season for it to become a hit. And it's like, you know, the biggest dating show in the world. I mean, when I post about Love is Blind, I'm serious, like my engagement is quadrupled. And I don't know if that's because it's a Netflix show and everybody can watch it all around the world, but you think back to season 1, and I do feel like nobody knew where that show was going to go. Nobody knew how big it was going to be. So it was a lot more genuine. But I do feel like we get a lot more real conversations on Love is Blind because it's not like The Bachelor where you get a final rose and you can do whatever you want with it. Like you have to get married or you have to break up. So there's all of these conversations that you need to have. And we have seen more conversations about political backgrounds and financial situations that you wouldn't normally see on something like The Bachelor because people are afraid to talk about it.
And of course, back to the Real Housewives, women just blindly signing documents from their husbands, which later land them in extreme legal and financial trouble, has been a disturbingly common occurrence on the show. See Teresa Giudice, Erica Girardi, and although Kyle Richards hasn't found herself in much trouble, she has admitted on the show to blindly signing all kinds of things from her estranged husband, who has to date been party to many, many lawsuits. Basically, the gender norms on the Housewives, while there are some female breadwinners, still revolve around a fundamentally housewife model, where the woman being younger, earning less, and not having a particularly developed career is considered the norm, whereas the reverse is constantly scrutinized, such as when a woman dates a younger or less established man. Justice for Carol Radziwill. But enough about the rich and famous, or supposedly rich and famous. Let's get back to the normies who want to be on reality TV and the high price that they have to pay to even walk through the door. With Chapter 5, the cost of #exposure. Ironically, the already rich do tend to make money off of their reality television appearances, but other people do not, either by not getting paid much from their appearance or not getting paid at all. Hoarders, for example, is now on its 15th season and famously exploits the lives of people often experiencing extreme mental illness, so what do they get paid for this voyeuristic view into their lives? Nothing. The show pays for removal and cleanup crews and a few months of therapy. And in some extreme cases, a bad edit on a reality show has cost participants their livelihood. According to an article in The Guardian from late last year, Nick Thompson, a Love is Blind contestant, credits the show's poor portrayal of him with his employment struggles post-filming. A former vice president of marketing, Thompson says he has applied to more than 400 jobs, has maxed out his unemployment, savings, and 401k, and is at risk of losing his home. But for a lot of reality shows, it goes much further than just not being compensated for your time. Contestants often end up spending enormous amounts of their own money or going into debt just for the chance to appear on these shows, and to maybe possibly further their career or land lucrative endorsement deals. And there's no better example of this than the spending histories of former contestants on RuPaul's Drag Race. Despite the fact that things like costumes, makeup, and wigs, and the quality or production value of all of these things heavily influence the outcomes of the show does not provide a budget for contestants to source these things. Out magazine has reported that contestants have spent as much as $100,000 of their own money on the looks they create for the show, though most who shared their spending fell more squarely into the $10,000 to $20,000 range, which is still a lot. Several seasons ago, in a rare bit of financial transparency on the Drag Race after show Untucked, two contestants, Ms. Cracker and Cameron Michaels, talked openly about the financial burden it takes to be a contestant. Ms. Cracker ultimately said, quote, "I spent more on this competition than I did on college." Meanwhile, RuPaul is over here making $1 million an episode now, 5 times what the winner of each season takes home before taxes, and he's making money off a small fracking empire. Now, there's no doubt that Drag Race has launched the careers of many a drag queen, some of which have gone on to become incredibly financially successful. I'm personally a regular consumer of basically all of Trixie and Katya's endeavors. And the show has also undeniably done some really important things for queer representation in mainstream media. But this is a very clear example about how reality TV in particular often exploits the people it is intending to represent for the benefit of the people at the top, who are usually not representative of the people being portrayed. And the Bachelor franchise is also famous for encouraging incredibly irresponsible pre-show spending. That hotness inflation we talked about earlier on reality TV is maybe most prevalent on The Bachelor. Listen, the people on that show were always hot young 20-somethings for the most part, but when you go back to the early seasons, there is a notable difference in how the contestants, especially the women, are portraying themselves. And looking that good on television is fucking expensive. Former Bachelorette Jillian Harris once mentioned remortgaging her home and spending $8,000 for her appearance as a contestant on Jason Mesnick's season. And while contestants on the franchise are sometimes paid, it's not really clear where lines are drawn, participation on those series often comes with other stipulations that can interfere with other money-making ventures. Former contestant Katie Morton said on the She's All Batch podcast that she was paid a flat rate of $10,000 for Bachelor in Paradise Season 6. But her contract stipulated that she could not take any brand deals until October of that year when the show ended. She even implied that her contract barred her from taking any other work while the show was in season. Morton had to leave her job in sales to go on Bachelor in Paradise Season 6 and then had to find a way to live off the $10,000 for several months. And it also seems that pay is not equal on Bachelor in Paradise. In the same interview, Morton learned that co-star Blake Hortzman was paid $800 per day while on the show, while others reportedly only got $400. Had he only been around one day, he'd only make $800, but he lasted around 20 days, making his pay around $16,000. Colton Underwood also reportedly negotiated a flat rate of $10,000 no matter how long he stayed on Bachelor in Paradise Season 5. Now, let's be clear that we need to break the fourth wall for a second here and say that the only reason contestants not being allowed to take brand deals really matters is because, hate to tell you guys that Santa Claus isn't real, but most people go on these dating shows just to raise their social media profiles and get said brand deals. But it's worth noting that on shows like The Bachelor, openly admitting to the real reason for participating is considered a massive faux pas.
I don't believe 100% of the people that are here are being authentic and are here for the right reasons.
All of this was falling for somebody that wasn't here for the right reasons.
I want to know that somebody's here for me, and honestly, I don't think he is here for me.
You have it on the back of your palm. I like to keep things short and simple, Ed, buddy.
Sexy, Eddie, you're wasting my time.
People here may not be ready for what it is that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I hated it.
How are you going to go about, are you going to tell him?
No.
I'm not here to be made a joke of, which is what I feel like you're doing right now with me. So I'm really gonna need you to get the out.
Because there isn't, in my opinion, a single person that goes onto the Bachelor franchise that doesn't want to be an influencer in some way, shape, or form. Whether or not that happens for them, we've seen a decline in that recently. I feel like the peak of the mountain when it came to Bachelor franchise was Hannah Brown, Pilot Peter, and even Matt James's season. But after that, people aren't getting as big of a following as they once were. They're just not automatically guaranteed to be, a social media presence as they were a couple years ago. So I think that is interesting just to see how much it's changed because the audience deems that as not being genuine. So when you have somebody that just goes on a show, maybe not necessarily to find love, but just to become a social media influencer, we don't like watching things that aren't real, and that is hurting their pockets at the end of the day.
And we actually spoke to former Bachelor contestant Becca Martinez about this very phenomenon on my podcast, The Financial Confessions.
And I don't know, the idea of here for the right reasons is that you're there to find love, but everyone knows like I said, you're on a TV show. And I think that the wrong reasons are going on for a platform, financial gain, exposure, all of those things. Those are the wrong reasons.
Why did you go on?
Oh my God. Well, this is the thing too. I don't think you can hate on anyone on the show for purely I don't think there's anything wrong with going on the show for exposure or social media followers or any of that. I think that some people are dishonest throughout the show, you know, and maybe pretending to feel a certain way, maybe lying to fellow contestants, all of that. That to me is like, all right, wrong reasons. But
sure.
I think most people go on the show being like, I'm going to gain a shit ton of Instagram followers and I'm going to be on TV and this is going to be fun. And if I find love in the process, that'll be great. So I think that was my thing. I mean, I definitely knew going on the show. I remember telling my dad, like, Dad, if I get like a few 100,000 Instagram followers, like this is potentially how much I could be making a month. And my dad was like, yeah, okay. And then now 3 years later, I'm like, what did I tell you, Dad?
Now, of course, on shows like the previously mentioned RuPaul's Drag Race, there is a much more explicit value proposition to contestants that you're coming here to further your career and make opportunities. But that's hardly a guarantee. And as we saw with contestants like the former Love is Blind participant, sometimes your appearance can have the opposite effect. And it's one thing to be living well beyond your means and often going into debt to change your appearance to be aesthetically pleasing enough for these shows or to have the supplies to participate in them. But where reality TV gets perhaps most dangerous and most fascinatingly mirrors our own economic development as a country is in how this genre intersects with real estate. Because listen, we can all put some wigs or even veneers on a credit card, but when we're engaging in like massively over-leveraged real estate fraud, things get dark quick. Which brings us to our final chapter, reality TV and exploiting the real estate dystopia. So I don't know if you guys have heard this, but buying a home has basically never been more out of reach for Americans than it is now. And yet we are positively swimming in a sea of viewing options dedicated to housing the upper echelons. On shows like Selling Sunset or Buying Beverly Hills, the focus is as much on the interpersonal lives of the agents as it is on the actual real estate they're selling, if not more so. And in most cases, these hyper-aspirational real estate shows are taking places in cities that are experiencing severe housing crises. Like, LA has an unprecedented unhoused population, and most people can't afford a regular 2-bedroom. But don't worry, there's a seemingly unlimited supply of $50 million mansions for the Selling Sunset girlies to pitch. But that being said, it's also very possible that many of the transactions being portrayed on this show are being exaggerated for entertainment. On Selling Sunset, for example, every cast member is genuinely a licensed real estate agent, and the Oppenheimers, the unsettling brothers who own the luxury real estate firm the show follows, have confirmed that every sale that happens on the show is real. However, only a handful of the dozens of agents employed by the Oppenheimer group is actually a cast member, so who knows how many have worked on sales without getting on-screen credit. And plenty of the docu-soap, as Netflix itself calls it, is manufactured. Mary famously was secretly married for 19 months before her wedding that took place at one of her listings on the show. And to me, these shows are ultimately doing exactly what shows like the Kardashians do, obscuring the reality of what we're actually looking at. Because there's simply no way we'll ever know whether these women's success actually comes from being good at real estate or from appearing to be good at real estate and leveraging that image to take on more and more brand deals and grow a bigger audience and to continue the cycle endlessly. I'm personally a huge fan of, in my opinion, underrated French reality show The Parisian Agency, which follows an unusually attractive family living in the Parisian suburbs with 4 sons who are all part of the real estate dynasty. It's essentially Selling Sunset with a bunch of hot French guys, and I will say there's much less focus on interpersonal drama, and therefore the real estate aspect of it I find to be much more satisfying. It also doesn't help that even the more realistic housing shows are just as much about performance as shows about the ultra-rich. House Hunters, for example, is supposedly a show that follows real-life people in their journey to buy a home, yet essentially the whole thing is staged. To speed up filming and production timeline, you already have to have an offer in on your new home to be considered for the show. Each episode shows participants touring 3 homes before they eventually choose at the end. The decision-making process you see on screen may mirror real-life concerns the participants had while searching for their home, but the reactions and conversations are scripted and filmed after the fact. The other 2 houses shown don't even have to be on the market to be used as filming locations. Now, clearly this is purely entertainment rather than an educational look into the home buying process, but when that process is so out of reach for many, shows like House Hunters should at the very least be forced to clearly disclose just how not real the reality they're presenting is. And once again, as a show featuring regular people rather than the already successful, the couples featured are barely compensated. As of 2023, they receive $500 to be on House Hunters or $1,500 for House Hunters International, but they also often have to take a week off of work for filming. But perhaps nowhere is the effect of reality TV more visible on our day-to-day lives than in the phenomenon of house flipping. Because we simply can't talk about the real estate dystopia and the reality TV effect without talking about HGTV. House flipping has undoubtedly contributed to skyrocketing housing costs that we've seen over the last decade plus, and HGTV and the popularity of shows like Fixer Upper and Flip or Flop are at least part of the reason. From a 2022 Atlantic article by Amanda Mull, quote, "Flipping and landlording are both seductive economic propositions, so much so that shows about successful self-made flippers and investment property renovators have become their own genre on HGTV, which is consistently ranked the most popular non-news cable channel. Those shows, in turn, introduced the idea to even more potential flippers and landlords. Last year, more than 5% of all houses sold in the United States were flips. The same has been true since 2017. Meanwhile, a quarter of all single-family home sales went to landlords, aspiring Airbnb tycoons, and other types of investors in 2021. All told, nearly a third of American house sales last year went to people who had no intention of living in them." House flipping is a phenomenon that has calcified the idea of real estate as being first and foremost an investment and secondly a place to live, and much more important than providing a basic human need. Which is even more hilarious when you consider just how shoddy and poorly thought out many of these flips tend to be. There's rarely an element of craftsmanship, the cheapest possible materials are often used, and this often seems to have almost no impact on the actual values of the home. And when you turn onto social media, you can see the trickle-down effects of this popularity in house flipping. Half of the quote-unquote personal finance advice on places like TikTok basically amounts to being an Airbnb slumlord, and countless accounts go viral for all the wrong reasons on a near-daily basis, for turning homes with beautiful period finishes into beige millennial wastelands that can be resold in the fastest way possible. I recently saw one on TikTok where the couple got like 11 million views and all hate comments because they painted an original 1970s stone fireplace millennial white and then installed a fake wood beam along the vaulted ceiling made out of foam. May those people never know peace. And individual house flippers are often not the same as the individuals buying a $75 million mansion on Selling Sunset, but it's all part of the hypernormalization of predatory real estate practices and unsustainable housing markets that reality TV helps to normalize. Now, reality TV is such a diverse pantheon of hashtag content that we have barely scratched the surface. There are so many more examples of performing reality that we could have talked about here, and maybe we will in a future video or podcast. The Circle, for example, may not be pulling in the views its first season did when we were under COVID lockdown and starved for any kind of distraction, but it's still going strong, having just launched its 6th season, and its fabricated social media competition is an almost too perfect microcosm of our relationship with reality TV. Contestants are competing to weed out the inauthentic on a show whose entire premise is manufactured. When catfishes are ousted, it is seen as a victory, but just as frequently are real competitors blocked in a ranked choice voting process that is a pure popularity contest. It perfectly exemplifies our own inability to distinguish what's real and what's not in reality TV and beyond. Ultimately, both economically and in terms of the media we consume, our world is becoming more glamorous and less real. We are constantly inundated with hyperinflated images of beauty and wealth, and in our individual lives, much less able to attain them. Millennials and Gen Z may never have homeownership, but they have an entire backlog of Selling Sunset so they can watch foreign aristocracy purchase an investment property they will spend a total of 3 days of their life in. We can all go into credit card debt attempting to make ourselves look as beautiful as the reality TV contestants who come back for a 2nd season. And we can present more and more expertly curated final cuts of our own lives on social media as we become less and less financially able to afford them. And just like with any other unhealthy thing we love to consume, and I love many of those things, this is not to say you can't enjoy some reality TV in moderation. It's just important to remember that, unlike the name suggests, most of what we're watching is barely real at all and has only been getting less so since the last recession. I'll see you guys next month. Bye.